The Newsagents USA.
Kamala. They were explaining to me, you can say Kamala, you can say Kamala. I said, don't worry about it. It doesn't matter what I say. I couldn't care less. If I mispronounce it or not, I couldn't care less. Kamala, sometimes referred to as Kamala. You know, she got about 9 different ways of pronouncing the name.
Donald Trump is struggling to pronounce the name of his opponent. And I think it's indicative of a wider struggle he's facing, which is not just her name, but what she stands for and what she's done to the fight. He simply doesn't know how to take her on.
And that is manifesting itself in various different ways, in anger, in frustration, and the polling evidence so far suggests that where 3.5 weeks ago Donald Trump was cruising to victory, he is now falling behind in the key battleground states. Can he define her? Can he turn it round? Welcome to the Newsagents USA. It's John.
It's Emily.
And what is fascinating is to look at some of the polling data now that sufficient time has passed between Joe Biden announcing that he's pulling out of the race and to today, just ahead of the Democrat convention next week in Chicago. And you suddenly look at the 3 Democrat states that are the critical states in this election of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, the sort of blue wall, if you like, the blue Democrat wall. And there, Kamala Harris is now handily 4 points ahead, according to the latest New York Times Siena poll, whereas Joe Biden was behind. And if you look at 3 of the Sunbelt states, the so-called Sunbelt states of Nevada, of Arizona and Georgia on the East Coast, which Biden just about squeaked in 2020, Biden was well behind. They are now in play. And the Democrats are suddenly looking at a map which is a lot better for them than it was a few weeks ago, and it's a catastrophe for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, this is your frequent reminder that one poll is just one poll, but a movement of polls or a poll of polls all starts to reflect the same picture, which was that essentially a race that was very much Trump's to lose just a month ago, where people in the Democratic Party were trying to define to Joe Biden just what would happen if he stayed in the race, are now looking at this totally different potential outcome. And you're right, you know, that the places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, our eyes have been on right the way through, and she seems to be making those gains. This is just a snapshot. All it means is that if the election were held tomorrow, would she look as if she could take those states? She would. It doesn't mean anything for an election that's in November. But they're also starting to talk in a different way. And one of the states that you'll now hear Democrats discussing is North Carolina. Now, North Carolina hasn't been in play since 2008. And the last time it was won by a Democrat is Obama. And I think that that somehow becomes quite totemic, because you've heard maybe us, maybe others say, oh, it's funny, there's a kind of enthusiasm, there's a kind of vibe now coming into the Harris campaign, which people haven't seen since the early days of Obama. Now, North Carolina somehow is exciting Democrats beyond all sort of reasonable measure, because they're thinking not just could she harden up some of these real swing states like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania, could she actually be about to take them, but could she start making inroads into places that really the Democrats haven't been thinking about at all. And I think what this talks of is just the amount of sentiment change, really. It's just about how people are feeling. And people talk about Tim Walz, her running mate, as being the sort of the joy candidate. He's put something back into this campaign, which is not doom, destruction, you're all going to hell. It's kind of like, this could be quite fun. We will have a laugh. We'll make jokes. The crowd loves it, right?
Exactly. So you know, you just think back a few months and us doing this podcast and us saying, look, if you look at the latest opinion polls, it's clear that Americans don't want either Trump and they don't want Biden either. You know, like 70% or so of Americans said we don't want either candidate, frankly. And so the fact that Biden has gone and you've got someone younger, a woman who is sort of dynamic as the candidate for the Democratic Party. Remember, a lot of people just didn't want either of them. And so, not surprisingly, they are going to Kamala Harris. But the map, if we just kind of talking about that great map of the United States, all 50 states, there are other states as well that are remarkably now being spoken about as being potentially in play. And one of them is Florida, which hasn't been in play for years and years and years. And in, the latest poll there, a USA Today poll, has Trump up 5 points. But when Ron DeSantis fought for the governorship as a Republican, he won it by kind of 16 points. I mean, huge, the difference that is taking place. Democrats are also starting to think, well, maybe Ohio, which was once seen as the kind of the bellwether state of America, long gone. So whereas a month, 2 months ago, you had Republicans talking about, God, look at these Democrat states we could win, like Virginia, New Hampshire, Minnesota. You've now got Democrats looking at Republican states and thinking we could potentially win there. And that is the scale of the transformation that has come in. Now, what you're absolutely right to point out is, one, these are polls today. They are snapshots. They are no indication of how people are going to vote in November. But two, that what we're getting from Kamala Harris and Walz is vibes, good vibes. They feel great about themselves. People like what they're saying. It's joyous, it's upbeat, it's fun, it's engaging, it's all those things. And it's not dark, which is the message of Trump. The question is, I suspect that they've still got to come to policy soon about how she defines herself in policy terms and whether she puts daylight between what she believes and what Joe Biden has been doing.
Yeah, I would predict that this is peak good vibes week for the Democrats. They're just about to go into their convention. They've had 3 weeks of, great headlines. The press has been pretty nice to them. The broadcasters haven't been able to get a sit-down interview with Kamala Harris, of which, more later. But I think she's going to have to face that, and she hasn't always found those head-to-head interviews that easy. Tim Walz has gone down very well with the crowds, and they have been out doing their campaigns together. And last night, solo, we heard from Tim Walz. And I just want to introduce one of the areas where Republicans have tried to actually make mischief with Tim Walz. And this is about his military record. He was in the military for 20 years. And in 2005, he announced that he would be retiring, stepping back so that he could run for Congress. And Republicans then said, J.D. Vance in particular has come forward and said, oh, isn't that funny? He quit the military just before he would have been sent to war in Afghanistan. And some people have hit back at Walz for saying that and saying it's a very dishonorable way of framing it. But I think it has also been over to Walz to explain why he left. Now, he's made it very clear that he actually retired, stepped back from the military months before his regiment was going to be sent to war. But last night, he decided to actually take on those criticisms face on. This is the first time we've heard him kind of having to sort of shout down some of the negatives that have surrounded him and his military record. Just have a listen.
And I firmly believe you should never denigrate another person's service record. To anyone brave enough to put on that uniform for our great country, including my opponent, I just have a few simple words. Thank you for your service and sacrifice.
So what the Trump campaign are doing, and there is a guy on the Trump campaign called Chris LaCivita, and he had previously been part of bringing down John Kerry over his military service in Vietnam, the Swift Boat Veterans Campaign, where some people who were in swift boats with John Kerry in Vietnam said that Kerry was nothing like the hero he portrayed himself as. His military service was awful. And, and they really, really damaged someone who had a great war record. What they're trying to do is to replay that tactic to bring down Walz because they see him as too popular. The problem you've got is that 20 years on, I mean, when Kerry was running in 2004, it was at the height of the Iraq War and Americans saying, do we want to be there? And therefore, kind of military record was seen somewhat differently than maybe it is today. Also, you have got someone at the top of the ticket, a Donald J. Trump, who 5 times managed to dodge the draft with some bone spurs in his feet, which never seemed to stop him playing golf endlessly.
Please explain what a bone spur. I've been listening to this whole kind of thing about Trump's bone spurs, and the image in my head is so strange. What is a bone spur?
Well, so you can have bits of fragment of bone that come off your foot in a funny kind of way, which means you can't run and you can't be as agile. But it doesn't seem to have impeded him in any other way except for the draft.
Military service.
Except for military service. So how good is it a look for Trump to draw attention to this when he's got a few questions to answer himself?
Okay, so I would say this was a partial win because J.D. Vance has said this isn't about military record, it's about lying about your military record, and Trump never pretended that he had gone into the military. And they pick on this phrase that Waltz had used about carrying weapons in war. And it was a phrase that he used to say, I don't like guns except, when you have to use them to defend yourself in war, carrying the weapons of war as I did. And Waltz, to be fair, has rode back and said he misspoke, whatever misspeak means, but he never carried weapons of war in a war. And so I think J.D. Vance can kind of chalk that up to a partial win, but I think he's also lost a lot of credibility with people who will say, just, be generous. I mean, for our, UK viewers who've just been through the general election with us, it's all sounding a bit Plymouth More View. Do you remember when Johnny Mercer was taking on Fred Thomas? And they were both veterans, so both ex-military men. And Mercer was trying to make out that Fred Thomas hadn't really been to war. And Fred Thomas was saying, oh no, I was in a sort of secret mission and I can't talk about it. And this whole thing became slightly petty sounding, if I'm honest, to the average viewer or voter, because you just want to think that everyone who fights for their country is a pretty decent person who will, do the best by their country.
Isn't that the point? It's petty.
Yeah.
And if that's all they've done their kind of detailed research on Walls, and if that's the best they've got about when he left the military, having served for 20
years ago.
Yeah. And then stands for Congress, and he didn't know when he left that his regiment was about to be deployed, so therefore he did it in all innocence. I mean, for goodness sake, I think that if that's the best they've got, then they've got
weak
strong.
sauce.
But meanwhile, J.D. Vance has been defending the childless Catwoman remarks, childless cat ladies of him disparaging people who don't have a stake in the country because they don't have children. This is him with Dana Bash from CNN, and I don't know about you, what you thought, Maitlis. I thought he was running rings round her slightly because she just wouldn't put the tough questions to him. Let's have a listen.
I never, Dana, criticize people for not having kids. I criticize people for being anti-child. And I do think that Kamala Harris has made some bizarre statements. She has said things like, it's reasonable not to have children over climate change. I think it's the exact opposite message we should be sending to our young families. I want to expand the child tax credit. I want to stop those surprise medical bills. I want to make housing more affordable so that if you have a young family, you can actually afford to put them in a home. And I think that it is unfortunate that so much of our public leadership has become anti.
Look, I agree with you. I think he had a pretty easy ride, not just on that show, but on several others, where you suddenly remembered that J.D. Vance is a lawyer and he's an advocate and he can actually argue his case pretty thoroughly. One thing I would say, though, is you hear him talking up child tax credits. He didn't turn up for the vote. And I do think it's funny, actually. I mean, there's been so much discussion over the UK general election. Sorry to keep making these comparisons, but it is quite funny about whether Labour should stop putting this cap on 2-child tax policies. And here you've got somebody who is very much on the right of the party, of the Republicans in the US, saying we do want child tax credits because actually that's how you encourage more people to grow more families and to sort of repopulate America. The only flaw in his argument being, as I say, he didn't turn up for the vote. So actually, he didn't really vote on that at all. But I think that he could argue his point in those Sunday interviews. But more widely, I think that will stick. Somehow, the whole cat lady stuff, and it was from a few years back, has just left the impression of a bit of a nasty frat boy. You know, it's just not somebody that your average American would feel very comfortable with, because loads and loads of Americans, loads of really prominent Republicans, like, you know, Condoleezza Rice, for example, you know, have not had kids and been incredibly successful at the top of the party. I'd be really interested to see him putting that theory to their face. You know what I mean?
We have spoken before about the problem the Republican Party has with women, particularly after the overturning of Roe versus Wade. And you look at all the evidence, wherever there has been a vote on the ballot about abortion, Americans have voted for a woman's right to choose. They've just announced that in Arizona in November, there will be a proposition on abortion. Now, that is hugely significant, because that really does put Arizona in play, because everywhere that people have voted on this issue, as I say, they have voted for a woman's right to choose. And if it's on the ballot in November, on that long ballot paper that people will get, it's going to encourage more women to vote. So at the top of the ticket, who are they going to vote for? Harris, who believes in a woman's right to choose, or Donald Trump, who was instrumental in appointing the Supreme Court judges that overturned Roe versus Wade.
Arizona being the state, of course, that just 3 months ago wanted to roll back the abortion law to a law that existed in 1864 before women had the vote, or Arizona was a state.
Well, we will be back after the break, and we'll talk about a bit more about the way Trump and Harris are fighting each other.
Here, I know the people of Nevada, you are battle-born. You are battle-born. And if Donald Trump wants to pick a fight over our most fundamental freedoms, we say, bring it on. Bring it on. Bring it on.
Kamala Harris is having the time of her life on the campaign stump. Wherever she goes, the crowds are there to basically throw back in her face the joy that she is giving to them. And Trump is having, I think, what has been described as the worst 3 weeks of his campaign, which, given that he has also been convicted and shot at and hit, is sort of an extraordinary place to be. But we have not seen him as low as this before. And I think that is exemplified by the fact that as she is travelling the country, he has been giving press conferences from not a swing state, not a sunshine state, not even a sort of home run state, but from Mar-a-Lago, from his own house, as if it was a sort of COVID lockdown mission. And he has been doing press conferences from there, because he hasn't actually been out where she has on the stump. Yeah,
but Emily, I think the crowds that we heard cheering for Kamala Harris there in that clip, they're not real people.
Fake.
It's AI generated, because actually no one has come to see Kamala Harris. No. Honestly, the weirdest thing about all of this is you're absolutely right to say that this has been the worst 3 weeks for Donald Trump on the campaign, because the polls have turned so decisively. Is he furious about the polls turning? Yeah, I'm sure he is. I'm sure he's fed up with that. What he seems most animated about, I mean, really, seriously, is that people are suggesting that she's getting bigger crowds than him.
Crowd sizes. Yep.
Crowd size. I mean,
there's always a crowd size problem.
Has anyone noticed? Let me read you this. Has anyone noticed that Kamala cheated at the airport? There was nobody at the plane, and she artificial intelligenced it and showed a massive crowd of so-called followers, but they don't exist. I'm sorry, they did exist. It's just bonkers stuff. And you kind of think, what is going on? And an increasing number of people are saying, okay, if we want to refocus the campaign, Donald, can we get a little bit past the grievance and then maybe just talk about the issues where we think that Kamala Harris is weak and that we can move on from that? And Donald Trump, for the moment, seems unable to get beyond the rage that someone is suggesting that he is getting bigger crowds than she is.
Look, here's a thought. He has not really been himself since that attempted assassination in Pennsylvania. And okay, you know, a lot of people are saying, well, he hasn't really changed the corner, he hasn't really lowered the temperature, he hasn't really become this sort of, you know, born again kind of lovely guy who wants kind of peace and love. but he may very well actually have a bit of PTSD, right? It is entirely possible that he's seeing her on the campaign stump. She's going to all these places, and something is, I don't know, keeping him away. Has he got more scared? Has he got more nervous of being out there? Is that what's doing his head in, maybe? You know, is there a fraction of that? Because when he was sort of hunkered down in Mar-a-Lago and he called the press to him rather than, you know, going out on the campaign on the stump, he then got asked a whole variety of questions. And one of his answers was really bizarre. It was about a near helicopter crash that he'd been in with a legislator who he said was Willie Brown. Just listen to this story.
Well, I know Willie Brown very well. In fact, I went down in a helicopter with him. We thought maybe this is the end. We were in a helicopter going to a certain location together, and there was an emergency landing. This was not a pleasant landing, and Willie was, he was a little concerned. So I know him pretty well. I mean, I haven't seen him in years, but he told me terrible things about her.
Now, as it turns out, Willie Brown then did an interview on CNN where he staunchly denied ever having been in a helicopter with Donald Trump or ever having been in a near crash. And it then turned out that Willie Brown might have been confused with another Brown, indeed another black legislator that Trump had confused awkwardly.
Well, the thing about that news conference as well that I think is interesting, and I kind of thought slightly concerning in terms of the way the 2016 election was fought, that I saw Trump's right-hand person putting out on Trump Social, Truth Social, Trump's social media platform, a picture of every TV network carrying the news conference live, which is pretty much where the broadcasters were in 2016. And when we interviewed on the podcast, Jeff Zucker, the former head of CNN, you know, him saying, hands up.
We did it too much.
We did it too much, and we just gave him free rein. And Donald Trump, you know, loves publicity, and he managed to seize back publicity with that press conference. Now, whether actually what he said did him any good or not is a moot point. As it is, what did his 2 hours with Elon Musk yield, apart from an awful lot of people saying that was one weird event?
It was boring, wasn't it? I mean, the truth that dare not speak its name is it was just quite a boring listen. Yeah. I mean, you know, even if you sort of put aside the weirdness and the kind of, the brotherliness and the fact that they were kind of in each other's pockets, I don't know many people that would have stuck out 2 hours of that, even without the sort of, 45-minute delay, because it actually isn't a very interesting listen. And I think this is going to be a problem that Trump has increasingly, which is that he is speaking to an ever diminishing circle. And part of the problem is that he's really only doubling down and speaking to his base on places like X that have been sort of Elon Muskified out of their sort of previous incarnation and become just even more Trump echo chambers. And part of it is also, to be fair, demographics. You know, the kind of people that voted for Trump 8 years ago are fewer by sheer dint of the fact that they are older or they were more prone to COVID and they may not be alive anymore. And the younger people that are coming through, Gen Z, could not vote, 8 years ago. And now Gen Z are the voters and they are loving what they're doing with Kamala Harris on TikTok or, on the sort of platforms that Trump isn't operating on and doesn't really see. And they may very well make the difference in sheer demographic terms to who actually comes out to vote.
Yeah. Going back to the Elon Musk thing, there was a bit where he talked about Kamala Harris and the fact that her picture had been on the front page of Time magazine. She was the cover girl of Time, and that's always a pretty sought after thing in American politics with, is this her time suggestion. And listen to the way he describes it when he's talking to Elon Musk.
She is terrible. She's terrible. But she's getting a free ride. I saw a picture of her on Time magazine today. She looks like the most beautiful actress ever to live. It was a drawing. And actually, she looked very much like our great first lady, Melania. She didn't look like Camilla. That's right. But of course, she's a beautiful woman. So we'll leave it at that, right?
Oh, my God. It's like two old guys playing pétanque. isn't it? Sort of like in a tiny corner of a little sort of, French village who are just rambling on at each other without actually hearing each other at all. I do not know what he meant. I mean, I think the trouble with Trump sometimes is that we try and make sense of things that actually just make no sense. And there wasn't really a point to what he was saying. Maybe he does find her beautiful. Maybe he doesn't find her beautiful. Maybe he was criticizing the fact Trump put her on. Maybe he was just wistfully thinking about Melania. We don't know. And the point is, Elon Musk didn't stop to ask what he meant, so we're none the wiser. Maybe it meant nothing, which is partly why this stuff is kind of hard to listen to.
Well, it's hard to listen to, and it's hard to believe that it's doing him any good. Let's take it for granted that the base that loves Donald Trump still loves Donald Trump and is going to love Donald Trump whatever. But to get him above 47% amongst the American electorate into a winning position requires you to win over converts, to win over people who are liberal Republicans or who are independents or disaffected Democrats.
Where are your converts? That's what you're asking,
where are
isn't
your converts?
Yeah.
And and how does any of this stuff help him? I do think something interesting. I mean, you've made two allusions now to the British general election. I'm going to make one to the Olympic Games, which have just passed, and none of us know what to do with our evenings now that the Olympic Games have stopped. But there was the fantastic 1500 metres race, which pitted the British runner against the Norwegian, and these were the two greatest runners, and no one else looked at anybody else. And for 3.5 laps, it is a battle between the two of them, and all they can do is look at each other. And at one moment, this American that no one has ever thought about just moves up, and in the last 50 metres, he becomes the gold medal holder. And that is Biden and Trump. They've been so busy looking at each other that that's all they can do. And I don't think that Donald Trump knows what to do, that Kamala Harris has come up on the inside and is pipping him to the post, because that looks like what is happening right now.
So the other person who is sort of in this race, but we keep forgetting is in this race, is the guy I keep wanting to call Robert Downey Jr.
Is he standing?
RFK.
Robert Downey Jr.
Yeah,
Wow.
I hope so. I'm really excited about that. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the guy with the worm in his brain, and the guy who introduced us to the dead bear cub story last week. Now, he has suffered a couple of setbacks in the last few days. And this is about where his name can or cannot appear on ballots. And he's found a setback in Pennsylvania now over irregularities through his sort of filing mechanism. And he's found irregularities in New York, where there is now a big question mark over whether he'll appear on that ballot paper because of, I think, his residency. Now, Robert Downey Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, whatever, was never going to win Pennsylvania or New York. Those were not going to be ever states in play. But it might just shift the maths, right? It might just shift what happens to the Trump vote, what happens to the Harris vote as things get closer. And I'm trying to work out, I mean, when it was Biden in the race, we thought that he was going to be taking votes off maybe both. I think with Harris in the race, he would only be taking votes off Trump. So if he's not in the race, does that help Trump? That's what we don't know yet, right?
He's absolutely confounding. The Kennedy name, you'd think that will appeal to Democrats. So anyone who doesn't look quite like Kamala Harris, well, maybe I vote for RFK Jr. But equally, his stance on vaccinations, he's a conspiracy theorist, appeals to an awful lot of Trump people. So is he going to, people just don't know the impact of RFK Jr. I get a sense that his appeal is starting to wane and his numbers are beginning to decline. But that said, if we're talking about states like Arizona or Georgia, which are in effect won in 2020 with a handful of votes difference, I mean 10,000 roughly.
Yeah, if you were Harris, states, you'd want him on those ballots, wouldn't you?
Well,
I think.
Yeah, I think it's really uncertain the impact that RFK Jr. is going to have on this race. We're going to take a break there, and before we go, we're going to look ahead to the Democrat convention. So before we go, just to say that the newsagents are moving out to Chicago next week, and we're going to be there for all of the Democratic Party convention. Biden speaking, Monday night, Barack Obama, Tuesday night, presumably Tim Walz, Wednesday night, Kamala Harris, Thursday night. God knows what other entertainment will have been organised, but the Democrats normally do put on quite a show. So we're going to be out there for all of that, which is going to be a very different feel of a convention compared to if Joe Biden was still at the top of the ticket.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? The ordering. So Biden speaks Monday, the first one. Barack Obama is Tuesday night, and then it goes into the VP, Tim Walz, Wednesday night, and then Kamala Harris does the sort of the showpiece Thursday, and properly accepts all the nomination, and the balloons come down from the ceiling, and it's a sort of a moment of sort of culmination. It's really interesting. I think the Clintons are also speaking, but haven't been given a sort of a night of it. I mean, I don't know how they fit in. You'll be watching the criminology of exactly which Democrat former leaders are more in fashion than others, right? And whether, is Hillary Clinton seen as an asset, or is she a reminder of the last time a woman stood, or is she seen as, is Bill Clinton seen as a bit sleazy nowadays, or is he seen as a brilliant orator and speaker and winner? I'll be really interested to see how that goes down. And also the relationship between Biden and Obama. I mean, that's the other photo that you really want to have, isn't it? To see if the two of them, do they hug? Do they kiss? Do they, on stage? Do you see any of that at all between two people who actually kind of ended up sort of not on the same side, at least in Biden's presidency?
Well, I read some reporting today suggesting that Biden is still furious with Barack Obama, that Barack Obama didn't say anything to Joe Biden's face about the need to get out of the race, that he was doing it all behind the scenes, that, I think it's quite a complicated relationship, and I think there's quite a lot of bad blood. And the other person, of course, that we haven't mentioned is Nancy Pelosi. And I would refer you to our daily episode that we did, where we had an extended interview with Nancy Pelosi. And I asked her about her relationship with Joe Biden now. Worth having a listen to it. Let's talk a bit about the election. As I say, you were in London at the end of April, and I saw you at the US Embassy in Regent's Park, and we had a brief conversation in which you said to me, 1, Joe Biden is just fine. 2, he is 100% going to be the candidate. 3, he's going to win in November. When did you change your mind?
When did he change his mind?
No, I think when did you change your mind on whether he could still be the candidate? Because you intervened on Morning Joe and kind of came out and said, he needs to make up his mind.
Right, I did. I said that, right. And again, with all due respect to your question, especially in light of my saying what I did, which is what I believe, that he would be our nominee. Events that followed were not so much about him, but about the campaign that he had to put him across. Remember, my mission is that what's-his-name will not be president of the United States. But with all due respect, I'm not having any discussion of any conversations I may have had about this. He made his decision, and his decision has led to Kamala being our nominee. And we're very proud of her.
But it was such an important moment of US history, and you did say what you said on Morning Joe, which was he's got to make up his own mind, which was a week after he had said, I've made up my mind, I'm running. Was it the debate performance which made you think things aren't where they should be?
No, I mean, it's really a question of how we're going to win the election. What was the campaign that was in place to win the election? Joe Biden is the most consequential president of modern times. He's remarkable. I've said he should be on Mount Rushmore.
You have been laudatory, Madam Speaker, about President Biden's record, and you've said in many interviews that you think he's the most consequential president for many years. You also said the other day, and a very intriguing comment, I thought, you said you'd nonetheless never been very impressed by his political operation. What did you mean by that?
Just what I said. But again, why don't we just talk about Kamala Harris and how we're going to win this election, rather than some concerns that I had about how one appearance could have been taken care of had there been other plans in the works, and it wasn't happening.
And you talked about the love that you have, your relationship. I mean, you think that relationship will endure when this election is long past?
I hope so. I hope so. But again, I'm not answering, so don't ask me. Okay.
It is a great interview. And what we love about that woman is that she is hard as nails.
Oh, yeah.
And she tells you straight up what she will be answering and what she won't be answering. But you were right there, because that is going to be a relationship that probably takes a while to heal. And it's very easy to do kind of revisionist history. But when you think back to, Biden's position and how he was pulled out the race, and I'm sure all fingers will be pointing to Pelosi this time round, you also go back to 2015 and the fact that Obama didn't appear to support his own vice president then, Joe Biden, and the fact that he backed Hillary Clinton, who then went on to lose, which then arguably let Trump become the president. I mean, there are so many questions that the Democrats will probably be having, amongst themselves over the years and decades to come, of who played the right card and who played the wrong card then. Was Obama fundamentally wrong to back Hillary Clinton over his VP, or did he think he was helping, project the first female president onto the stage rather than another kind of older white man? I mean, these things are, of course, impossible, and it's all sort of counterfactual because what's done is done. But I think they will play into some of the emotions that you're going to see on the stage next week.
Well, I think what you have is what crime writers call the perfect murder, where you are left with a body, but you don't know how they died or who killed them. And Nancy Pelosi, I think, is trying to almost create herself in that role, where she says, it was Joe Biden who decided. It was Joe Biden who killed himself. I didn't play any role. All I cared about was that Joe Biden...
There are no fingerprints.
There are no fingerprints on Nancy Pelosi, and you're not going to find any. But my God, did she play a role in all of that? And that is what is going to make the Democratic Party convention next week absolutely fascinating as well. We will see you.
Thing.
Yes, well, we'll see you from there. I'm sorry you're not going to be with us, Maitlis. We will be with you from Chicago next week. Bye-bye.
Have fun. Bye for now.
The Newsagents USA.